And thus, though surrounded by circle upon circle of consternations and affrights, did these inscrutable creatures at the center freely and fearlessly indulge in all peaceful concernments. Yeah, serenely reveled in dalliance and delight. But even so, amid the tornadoed Atlantic of my being, do I myself still forever centrally disport in mute calm. And while ponderous planets of unwaning woe revolve around me, deep down and deep inland there, I still bathe me in eternal mildness of joy. What's up, guys? It's the host. You're watching The Gray Medium, and today I am doing my 4th of 5 videos on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. If this is your first time viewing this series, I've been breaking up Herman Melville's Moby Dick into 5 separate parts. In video 1, I covered chapters 1 through 25, in 2, 26 through 50, 3, 51 through 75, and in this video, video number 4, I'm covering chapters 76 through 100. If you're interested in checking out videos 1, 2, 3, or 5, I'll go ahead and link them in the description down below. And if you're new to The Gray Medium, this is the channel where I'm constantly trying to find the balance between black and white. That is gray. What that means to me is trying to find the balance between both mind and body. So regardless of if I'm in the gym lifting weights or if I'm in the library reading books, I'm always trying to do something to improve upon my mind or my body. Today, obviously, we're working on our minds, but if you're interested in watching an athletic video, I'll make sure to link one here. Or if you're interested in checking out a different academic video, I'll make sure to link one here. Both of these videos will be available in the description down below. Without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And with this part of the novel, chapters 76 through 100, I really feel like choosing only 5 chapters to cover this span of chapters is really just not doing the book justice. I'm really under-delivering on, the true beauty of the prose of these chapters. And I do want to say that there are multiple more chapters that I would have loved to include in this video, but for the sake of time, I'm only picking the 5 most important chapters to me. So the 5 chapters that I'm going to be covering in this video will be Chapter 79, The Prairie, Chapter 80, The Nut, Chapter 86, The Tale, Chapter 87, The Grand Armada, and Chapter 96, The Tryworks. And the honorable mention chapter has to be chapter number 89, titled Fast Fish and Loose Fish. This chapter, chapter 89, Fast Fish and Loose Fish, is really philosophically valuable. Even the prose in it is pretty witty and it's pretty funny, but it didn't quite make the cut. But I do want to make it a point to say that chapter 89 is really good as well. So the first chapter that I wanted to cover in this video is chapter 79, The Prairie. So the brow of a face and the forehead above it can be compared to a prairie. The way that a prairie can be rich in life, a brow can house a brilliant mind, and it can be rich in knowledge and experience. So he's quite literally drawing the comparison between a prairie that has a lot of life and a face that has a big forehead, essentially housing a lot of brains and a lot of knowledge behind it. So the narrator of this chapter, who is it? I don't know. Is it Ishmael? Is it Queequeg? Is it Ahab? I really don't know. It's hard to tell who the narrator is after chapter 35 of this book. But the narrator essentially makes comparisons to the brow of Shakespeare or Melanchthon and how genius they are and how big their brow is in relation to their genius. So it only makes sense that in a creature like the sperm whale that has an absolutely enormous head, the front of his head, or his brow for that matter, is very large. It would only make sense if the sperm whale, by consequence of having such a large brow, of having such a large forehead, would have such a great, immense amount of knowledge as well. The sperm whale doesn't have eyes on the front of his face, they're on the sides. He doesn't really have a nose dividing the face in half like humans do either. He doesn't have the facial features that humans have that would limit or essentially downplay the magnitude of his brow, of his forehead. But obviously the sperm whale hasn't wrote books, he hasn't made speeches, so this chapter is essentially pointing to the idea that the genius of the sperm whale is simply unspoken. And to quote directly from my commonplace book entry, I wrote, "The sperm whale, having written no books and having made no speeches, feels no need to make his genius known. For even if he were to speak, those awaiting ears would be simply incapable of understanding his divine expression. Resultingly, they would fear him to the point of hunting him, which is unfortunately what they already do. In turn, proving his genius to be beyond human comprehension." See, man doesn't understand the genius of whale. He can't grasp the genius of the sperm whale because the sperm whale can't speak in his tongue. So what does man do? Man hunts, man fears what it is that he doesn't understand. In this case, it's great whales. And the comments made on the importance of the brow in both human and man are made here on page 379. The text reads, "Human or animal, the mystical brow is as the great golden seal affixed by the German emperors to their decrees. It signifies, God, done this day by my hand, but in most creatures, nay, in man himself. Very often the brow is but a mere strip of alpine land lying along the snow line." So simply put, the brow of the Leviathan can be rich in knowledge the same way that a prairie can be rich in life, but the sperm whale has no desire to make his knowledge known or heard because man simply wouldn't be capable of understanding and receiving it. And truth be told, the knowledge of Moby Dick is simply beyond our understanding. The text reads, "But in the great sperm whale, this high and mighty godlike dignity inherent in the brow is so immensely amplified that gazing on it in that full front view, you feel the deity and the dread powers more forcibly than in beholding any other object in living nature. For you see no one point precisely, not one distinct feature is revealed. No nose, ears, eyes, or mouth. No face he has none. Proper. Nothing but that one broad firmament of a forehead, pleated with riddles, dumbly lowering with the doom of boats and ships and men. Nor in profile does this wondrous brow diminish, though, that way viewed, its grandeur does not domineer upon you so. In profile you plainly perceive that horizontal, semi-crescentic depression in the forehead's middle, which in man is Lavater's mark of genius." The second chapter that I want to cover in this video is chapter number 80, The Nut. So obviously the previous chapter made some pretty hefty claims as far as the size of the whale's brow, the size of the whale's head, essentially implying that the whale has an enormous amount of genius and enormous amount of knowledge. It's kind of funny that these chapters are right after one another, and obviously it's done intentionally because this chapter, chapter 80, The Nut, immediately backtracks on everything that the previous chapter just said. And it's these constant changes in perspective that almost make me feel like the actual narration, the narrator of chapter 79 and the narrator of chapter 80 are two different people, but at this point in the book, it's pretty much impossible to tell who's narrating what chapter. So at the start of this chapter, Melville wastes no time to explain how the actual anatomical structure of the sperm whale's head proves that a large amount of the front of the sperm whale's head is almost just like a reservoir, almost just like a vat, essentially there to house the spermaceti oil. So this whole idea that the sperm whale has a ginormous brain that's located in the front of its head is immediately disproven here because we now know by studying the whale's anatomy that that is essentially just a big empty pocket in the front of the sperm whale's head, which is where all of that spermaceti oil is held. But this insult, or at least that's how I see it, is more than made up for when the chapter starts talking about the importance of the whale's backbone. A pretty interesting conversation is opened up here between chapter 79 and chapter 80, in which there's a philosophical debate about whether the skull of the whale or the backbone of the whale is truly a more accurate representation of the whale's character. Likewise, the conversation is also opened up as to if the skull of man or if the backbone of man is a more valuable representative of his true character. This rebuttal to the lack of brains that the sperm whale allegedly has is offered here on page 382. The text reads, "For I believe that much of a man's character will be found betokened in his backbone. I would rather feel your spine than your skull, whoever you are. A thin joist of a spine never yet upheld a full and noble soul. I rejoice in my spine as in the firm, audacious staff of that flag which I fling half out to the world." And this opens a really important conversation to be had here about the fact that regardless of what we think about the sperm whale's brains or his lack thereof, his backbone is absolutely ginormous. The same way that we see this head of the sperm whale, and in comparison to man, it is disproportionately large, the spine of the sperm whale is even more disproportionately large in relation to the spine of man. The backbone of the whale almost runs the length of his entire body from the end of that reservoir that's housing the spermaceti oil on the top of his head all the way to the base of his tail. And a comment is made here on the very next page, 383, and the text reads, "For viewed in this light, the wonderful comparative smallness of his brain proper is more than compensated by the wonderful comparative magnitude of his spinal cord. So regardless of what could be said about the sperm whale and his brain, the fact of the matter is that he's got one hell of a spine. If we're really looking at what it is that you would expect a skull or a brain to stand for, and what it is that you would expect a spine or a backbone to stand for, I personally would imagine the skull to be representative of the God-given knowledge, of the genius of the brain of the sperm whale, which, like I said, in that case would really just be God-given. Whereas the spine or the backbone would really be more representative of the work ethic or the character or the robustness or the resilience that the whale has. And regardless of if we're going to open this discussion on if sperm whales are smart or not, spoiler alert, making this video in 2025, they definitely are. But even if we were to go out on a limb and say that sperm whales are just complete idiots, they're stupid, which again, they're not, but if we were to say that, we could still say that they are so strong, they're immensely tough, and they are so resilient, especially considering the fact that in this book, they are literally being hunted. These sperm whales, as I mentioned in the previous video, are getting hunted to the point to where when they're killing new whales, they're recognizing that these whales have lances that have been embedded into the blubber of these whales, and their blubber has grown around these lances years later, meaning that these sperm whales are surviving attacks and living decades later to go on and to continue to survive multiple attacks. So it's safe to say that no matter what we say about the sperm whale and his knowledge, no matter what we say about the sperm whale and his brain, he's really, really tough, and he's got one hell of a spine. The next chapter that I wanted to touch up on was chapter number 86, The Tail. This chapter speaks on the strength of the tail and how its strength is a big part of what contributes to its beauty. Whereas a being or a structure that lacks strength, therefore it lacks beauty as a consequence. I think that this could really closely be tied to what it is that Jordan B. Peterson said about being a quote-unquote monster.
And that's to say that, well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous.
Peterson essentially claimed that if you are capable of doing wrong, if you are capable of doing evil, and you choose to do good, then you're virtuous. However, if you're incapable of doing evil, you're simply not capable of doing those things, you can't do bad, and then you don't do bad, you're not virtuous, you're simply harmless. You're not given the choice to do bad, so when you don't do bad, that doesn't make you virtuous, it just makes you harmless, which isn't really a measure of your character, it's just a measure of your lack of ability to actually serve as a real threat. And I think that that is very similar to what Melville is saying here about strength. This is explained well here on page 411. The text reads, "Nor does this, its amazing strength, at all tend to cripple the graceful flexion of its motions, where infantileness of ease undulates through a titanism of power. On the contrary, those motions derive their most appalling beauty from it. Real strength never impairs beauty or harmony, but it often bestows it. And in everything impossibly beautiful, strength has much to do with the magic. Take away the tied tendons that all over seem bursting from the marble in the carved Hercules, and its charm would be gone." So when talking about the tail, it's explained how the tail is immensely strong, it's densely layered with muscle tissue, and it's capable of completely crushing boats, it's capable of propelling this huge whale through the ocean, it's capable of snapping whale lines, it's capable of decapitating men if it's swung at a fast enough speed. This tail is immensely powerful and capable of mass destruction, really, but it's also part of what makes the whale so beautiful. And I like the comparison made here with Hercules, because if you were to remove the strength, if you were to remove the muscles from the statue of Hercules, then the statue would, as a consequence, lose a lot of its beauty. And if you were to remove the tail and the great power that comes from the tail, from the sperm whale, it would lose a large part of its beauty as well. And this ties into the idea that strength doesn't take away from beauty, but strength rather contributes to beauty. And obviously with a sperm whale, there's no real way for us to measure the exact strength of this tail. It's not like we could hand him a barbell and ask him to lift it. It's not like there's a way in which we could actually measure the strength of this tail, at least not in the time that this book was written, and that is acknowledged here towards the end of the chapter. A lot of the allure surrounding great whales is around the fact that we don't actually know everything there is to know about them, at least not in the moment in time in which this book was written. This is expressed here on page 414. The text reads, "Dissect him how I may, then I but go skin deep. I know him not, and never will. But if I know not even the tail of this whale, how understand his head? Much more, how comprehend his face? And when face he has none. Thou shalt see my back parts, my tail, he seems to say, but my face shall not be seen. But I cannot completely make out his back parts, and hint what he will about his face. I say again, he has no face." So we may know the anatomy of the sperm whale, but we will never truly know the sperm whale. And I know that I've said this at least once in each one of these first 4 videos, but this chapter really has some of the most beautiful prose I've ever read in my life. And that is chapter 87, The Grand Armada. So in this chapter, it's stated how the Pequod only carries about 1 year's worth of clean drinking water. Obviously, when they're leaving Nantucket, they could only have so many barrels of water on this ship, so it's essential that somewhere along the course of their voyage, which is scheduled to last 3 years, that they stop and they hit up a dock and they restock on water or any of the goods that they're running out of at that point in the voyage. So as they are sailing around one of the southmost parts of Asia, there's essentially an area that has docks, which is where you would go and dock your ship, in this case the Pequod, and to restock on clean drinking water, on fresh drinking water. However, it's also mentioned how this area is known, and it's infamously known, for having a lot of pirate activity. So there is the intrinsic risk of docking your ship and then some pirates catching up to you and attacking you, but that's really not what it is that stops Ahab from wanting to pull the Pequod into the dock and to get more fresh drinking water. And it's through the prose of this chapter that we see the real intentions of Ahab here are to continue chasing the whales. He is more concerned with chasing the whales than he is his own well-being, and we've actually seen how throughout the course of this voyage that has been reciprocated, and that has been pushed downstream to the rest of the sailors on this ship. They're more concerned with trying to catch up with this herd of whales that they see out in front of them than they are stopping to get more fresh drinking water, and they're more concerned with chasing these whales that they see out in front of them than they are protecting themselves against pirates who would definitely try to board the Pequod, kill them, and steal their loot. And this is one of those moments in the book where you really recognize that even the characters like Ishmael, who had no previous whaling experience, have already been indoctrinated into this life of being a whaleman, this life of being at sea and becoming consumed and obsessed with this idea of killing the white whale. So much so that it's prioritized over fresh drinking water. So Ahab and the rest of the Pequod acknowledge that there is an absolutely enormous just group of whales, significantly larger than any group of whales that you would normally see together, and they're all reeling, they're writhing, they're thrashing around. They essentially see a huge cluster of whales, 10 times, 15 times, 20 times the size of a normal unit of whales, and they're all just going absolutely berserk. So they take the initiative to just sail straight past the docks and to go ahead and to pursue these whales. Melville starts to paint the picture here on page 419 as he states, "Ahab to and fro paced the deck, and in his forward turn beholding the monsters he chased, and in the after one the bloodthirsty pirates chasing him." Just a paragraph down the page on 419 the text continues, "But thoughts like these troubled very few of the reckless crew. The harpooners seemed more to grieve that the swift whales had been gaining upon the ship than to rejoice that the ship had so victoriously gained upon the Malays." And it's in this moment that we recognize that these men really have truly gone mad, and it goes back to a conversation that was had in the last video. In the last video, there was a discussion that was opened up connecting the desire to feed, like dogs sitting around a table where meat is getting carved up. That desire for them to feed is very animalistic, And regardless of what man says, he still demonstrates that animalistic desire to feed in himself. And that's reflected here in page 420. The text reads, "Best, therefore, withhold any amazement at the strangely gallied whales before us. For there is no folly of the beasts of the earth which is not infinitely outdone by the madness of men." At this point in the novel, we've seen these men become animalistic, and they've really given into their primal desires to hunt and to kill this white whale, so much so that they're out of touch with the reality. They're out of touch with the fact that they don't have clean drinking water. They're out of touch with the fact that they're being hunted by pirates. They're so consumed with this chase of the white whale, and psychologically this is a really interesting crew to follow at this point. And I feel like this chapter completely just runs you right off an edge, because you're following how just deranged these men have become, and then all of a sudden you just get hit with the most beautiful, euphoric, just grandiose prose talking about how it is that they came up on this huge herd of sperm whales, who typically only roll in groups of 20 to 50, and this is hundreds of sperm whales, and it's a ginormous group, and they're all reeling and they're writhing, they're thrashing, they're making a mess, they're freaking out everywhere. But while they're on this boat, they end up floating out into the middle of this big circle of these whales that are just absolutely going nuts. And they have a sense of an eye of the storm type of thing going on here, where they've rolled into the middle of this cluster of whales, and there's a 2 or 3 mile radius in the center that is completely calm. The water is glass, it's clear, and there's actually whales that are in that water nursing their babies. It is absolutely gorgeous prose, and I have to show you guys this quote from page 423. So after they roll into what page 422 describes as the enchanted calm which they say lurks at the heart of every commotion, 423 follows up and states, "The entire area at this juncture, embraced by the whole multitude, must have contained at least 2 or 3 square miles." A few lines down, the text continues, "These smaller whales, now and then visiting our becalmed boat from the margin of the lake, evinced a wondrous fearlessness and confidence, or else a still, becharmed panic which it was impossible not to marvel at. Like household dogs they came snuffing round us, right up to our gunwales and touching them, till it almost seemed that some spell had suddenly domesticated them. Queequeg patted their foreheads, Starbuck scratched their backs with his lance, but fearful of the consequences for the time refrained from darting it. But far beneath the wondrous world upon the surface, another and still stranger world met our eyes as we gazed over the side. For suspended in those watery vaults floated the forms of the nursing mothers of the whales, and those that by their enormous girth seemed shortly to become mothers." In this chaos, there is an eye in the storm. In this chaos, there is calm. And this relates back to the opening quote that I read to start this video. That quote spoke of how even in the Atlantic of my being, even in the most hectic, most violent, most treacherous place on the planet, the ocean, there is still calm, there is still peace, there is still tranquility to be found. And I think that this chapter is the chapter that makes the environmentalist in me shed a single thug tear. I mean, this chapter is rough because you see the just blatant violence that is going on as they are just going in on hunting these whales, and you see how crazy these men are and how deranged they are leading up to this point, and then it kind of just seems like everything comes to a dead stop, like you hit a brick wall and you're just overcome with the beauty of the prose of this chapter. And the chapter essentially has, you know, those first 2 or 3 pages that are really, really crazy, and then those middle 2 or 3 pages that are just calm, they're just beautiful. And then it almost doesn't let us get the satisfaction of having a chapter end happily, or at least having a chapter end happily for the whales, because the chapter then turns around and states one of the hardest things to read in this entire novel up until this point. So upon their recognition of the fact that they're in this calm spot, they start to look out towards the distant edges of the circle where things are going down, where these whales are now at this point starting to attack one another. On page 425, the text reads, "But agonizing as was the wound of this whale, and an appalling spectacle enough, anyway, yet the peculiar horror with which he seemed to inspire the rest of the herd was owing to a cause which at first the intervening distance obscured from us. But at length we perceived that by one of the unimaginable accidents of this fishery, this whale had become entangled in the harpoon line that he towed. He had also run away with the cutting spade in him, and while the free end of the rope attached to that weapon, he permanently caught in the coils of the harpoon lying round his tail. The cutting spade itself had worked loose from his flesh, so that, tormented to madness, he was now churning through the water, violently flailing with his flexible tail, and tossing the keen spade around him, wounding and murdering his own comrades. I swear Melville couldn't just let us have one chapter that allowed us to recognize the beauty of these creatures. He had to end this chapter by explaining how that whale got tangled up in a whale line, which was attached to a spade, and the whale, not knowing any better, starts freaking out and starts flinging this spade around, wounding and murdering his comrades. So this picture of chaos with peace and tranquility is painted just so that Melville can then rip you out of the peace and tranquility and throw you back into the chaos just as the chapter is ending. It sucks to read because it's brutal, but at the same time, it really is just a masterclass done by Melville. The final chapter I wanted to cover in this part is chapter number 96, The Tryworks. And I know I said this about chapter 87, The Grand Armada, but oh my goodness. Chapter 96, The Tryworks, is just completely covered in beautiful language, and it really does showcase how great of a writer Melville truly was. And I want to read directly from my commonplace book here, and to show you guys the emotion that I felt while I was reading this chapter, and to just show you exactly what I put down right as I was reading this. My commonplace book reads, "The darkness that engulfs the Pequod at midnight swallowed me as I read the chapter. I had nothing other than the Tryworks light to guide my eyes upon the page." Essentially, at this point in the voyage, they haven't had to burn anything in the Tryworks. The Tryworks are similar to that of like a pizza oven. It's essentially like a big fireplace, stove, pizza oven thing that requires wood to get started. But once they've done their first burning in the Tryworks, they could essentially burn little bits of shriveled up oil fat, whale fat that is, and they could essentially run this Tryworks off of nothing other than whale products once they've gotten it started. So the narrator of this chapter really continues to run home with this repetition of darkness, of blackness. It is midnight and it's completely dark. They're out in the middle of the ocean, so there's no light pollution. Anything other than the moon is completely black. You could barely see anything. So once they start burning these whale products in the Tryworks, this glowing light emits from the Tryworks and starts to project itself over all the contents of the ship. And the language that's provided here on page 463 is absolutely beautiful. The text reads, "Wrapped for that interval in darkness myself, I but the better saw the redness, the madness, the ghastliness of others. The continual sight of the fiend shapes before me, capering half in smoke and half in fire. These at last begat kindred visions in my soul. So soon as I began to yield to that unaccountable drowsiness which ever would become over me at the midnight helm." So we're now coming to realize that the narrator of this chapter is actually the man at the helm of the ship. He's the man steering the ship. And it's almost as if he's having a hallucination. It's almost as if the light from the Tryworks is illuminating what Jung would call the shadow of man. If you haven't seen my series on Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols, a man's shadow is essentially the attributes that are residing in his unconscious mind, the parts of himself that he has failed to yet acknowledge. And it seems as if the ghastliness of man, or the evil attributes of his shipmates, or the evil nature of what it is that they're doing, going out into the sea, hunting innocent creatures, and then burning those creatures' flesh, it's almost as if this man at the helm is all at once being consumed and overrun by the realization of what it is that they're actually doing. And once he recognizes this chapter takes a turn for the worse. On page 464, the text reads, "But that night, in particular, a strange and ever since inexplicable thing occurred to me. Starting from a brief standing sleep, I was horribly conscious of something fatally wrong." A few lines down, the text continues, "I was half conscious of putting my fingers to the lids and mechanically stretching them still further apart. But spite of all this, I could see no compass before me to steer by, though it seemed but a minute since I had been watching the card. By the steady binnacle lamp illuminating it. Nothing seemed before me but a jet gloom, now and then made ghastly by the flashes of redness. Skip a few pages further down 464, and the text continues. A stark, bewildered feeling as of death came over me. Convulsively my hands grasped the tiller, but with the crazy conceit that the tiller was, somehow, in some enchanted way, inverted. My God, what is the matter with me? Thought I. Lo! In my brief sleep I had turned myself about and was fronting the ship's stern, with my back to her prow and the compass. In my instant I faced back, just in time to prevent the vessel from flying up into the wind and very probably capsizing her. How glad and how grateful the relief from this unnatural hallucination of the night, and the fatal contingency of being brought by the lee. So this man who was at the helm of the ship was so just completely thrown for sorts by the redness of the try-works, by the light that was emanating from this burning fire, that he became completely disoriented, and when he came to and recognized where he was, proprioceptively speaking, he recognized that he had completely turned around. He was facing the opposite direction, and the actual thing that he was supposed to be using was completely inverted until he recognized, holy smokes, I'm facing the wrong way entirely. He had to turn around just in time to grab the wheel again and to steer the Pequod out of a enormous wave that would have very possibly completely tipped the ship over. And this chapter concludes by explaining how you cannot see the try-works as a true lamp. The only true lamp is the sun. Essentially what this chapter is pointing at is that this try-works is going to show you the things that you don't want to see. It's going to show you the dark side of man. The chapter talks about how 2/3 of the earth is covered by the ocean, and the ocean in that sense is the dark side of the earth. It is the 2/3 of the earth that is dark, and the book goes on to explain how, and the chapter goes on to explain how there is a dark 2/3 of every book, there is a dark 2/3 of earth, there is a dark 2/3 of man. And it states that here on page 465 when the text reads, "So therefore that mortal man who hath more of joy than sorrow in him, that mortal man cannot be true, not true or undeveloped, with books the same. The truest of all men was the man of sorrows, and the truest of all books is Solomon's, and Ecclesiastes is the fine hammered steel of woe." So the light of the try-works is simply hypnotizing. It proves to create ghastly projects that toil with the mind. Although the sun is the one true lamp, it hides 2/3 of the earth's dark side, the ocean, and it also hides 2/3 of man, his dark side. All things, even those that appear luminous, have dark sides. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Of course, if you've made it this far, I greatly appreciate you. If you want to see any of the other Herman Melville Moby Dick videos, like I said, all of those ones will be linked in the description down below. And if you're interested in checking out another mind or body video, I'll make sure to include these in the description down below as well. So leave a comment down below to start a discussion, and make sure to like if you enjoyed, and of course subscribe if you're new. Until next time, I'm the host, you're watching The Gray Medium. Stay gray.